Hey Panthers, welcome back. It is time for another episode of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Today's story is all about Sammy. It was a horrible, stinky, rainy day. Some rainy days are fun and exciting, but not this one. This one stunk. All the kids were wet and wore smelly raincoats. The whole room smelled awful. Ugh, it stinks in here, said Mauricia. Everybody laughed, but she was right. There was one good thing, however. There was a new boy in class. New kids are always fun. Except no one could even tell what the new boy looked like. He was completely covered by his raincoat. Class, said Mrs. Jewls, I'd like you all to meet Sammy. Let us show him what a nice class we can be. Leslie walked up and smiled at Sammy, but her smile quickly turned into a frown. You smell terrible, she said. Leslie, exclaimed Miss Jewls, that's no way to greet a new member of our class. Mrs. Jewls wrote Leslie's name on the blackboard underneath the word discipline. But he does, Mrs. Jewls. He smells awful. You're ugly, Sammy replied. Now, Sammy, that's no way to talk, said Mrs. Jewls. Leslie's a very pretty girl. She's ugly, said Sammy. Allison spoke up. Well, you smell terrible and are probably even uglier, but nobody can even see you because you're hiding under that smelly old raincoat. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jewls. Now, Sammy, why don't you take off your coat and hang it in the closet? Let us all see how nice you look. I don't want to, you old windbag, said Sammy. That's because he's so ugly, said Leslie. I'm sure he's quite handsome, said Mrs. Jewls. He's just shy. Here, let me help you. Mrs. Jewls took off Sammy's coat for him, but underneath it was another raincoat, even dirtier and smellier than the first one. They still couldn't see his face. Ugh, now he smells even worse, said Mauricia. You don't exactly smell like a rose either, Sammy replied. Mrs. Jewls took off his second raincoat, but there was still another one under that, and the smell became so bad that Mrs. Jewls had to run and stick her head out of the window just to get some fresh air. You're all a bunch of pigs, Sammy screeched. Dirty, rotten pigs! The smell was overpowering. Sammy just stood there, hidden under all his raincoats. Miss Jewls wrote Sammy's name under the word discipline. Send him home on his kindergarten bus, said Joy. Not with me, said Todd. Mrs. Jewls held her nose, walked up to Sammy, and removed his raincoat. She threw it out the window. But he had on still another one. Sammy hissed, Hey, you old windbag, watch where you throw my good clothes. Mrs. Jewls put a check next to Sammy's name on the blackboard. Then she took off another raincoat and threw it out the window. The smell got worse, for he had on still another one. Sammy began to laugh. His horrible laugh was even worse than his horrible voice. When Sammy first came into the room, he was 4 feet tall. But after Mrs. Jewls removed 6 of his raincoats, he was only 3 feet tall, and there were still more raincoats to go. Mrs. Jewls circled his name and removed another coat. She threw it out the window. Then she put a triangle around the circle and threw another one of his coats outside. She kept doing this until Sammy was only 1.5 feet high. With every coat she took off, Sammy's laugh, ha 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 ha, got louder, and the smell got worse. Some of the children held their ears. Others could only hold one ear because they were holding their nose with the other hand. It was hard to say which was worse, the laugh or the smell. Sammy stopped laughing and said, ha 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 ha! Old windbag, if you take off one more of my coats and throw it out the window, I'll bite your head off. They smell too bad for me to allow them in my classroom, said Mrs. Jewls. You can pick them up when you leave. They smell better than you do, pighead, Sammy shouted. Mrs. Jewls didn't stop. She took off another one of his coats, then another, then another. Sammy was only 4 inches tall, 3 inches tall, 2 inches tall. At last, she removed the final coat. All that was there was a dead rat. Well, I don't allow dead rats in my classroom, said Mrs. Jewls. She picked it up by the tail, put it in a plastic bag, and threw it away. Mrs. Jewls didn't allow dead rats in her class. Todd once brought in a dead rat for show and tell, and Mrs. Jewls made him throw that one away too. I'm glad Sammy isn't allowed in our class, said Rondi. I didn't like him very much. Yes, said Mrs. Jewls, we caught another one. Dead rats were always trying to sneak into Mrs. Jewls' class. That was the 3rd one she'd caught since September. And that ends this chapter. See you back for another one tomorrow.